At 95 years old, Dick Van Dyke stunned the world with a revelation he had hidden for his entire career. For decades, his charm, laughter, and timeless energy masked a truth that could reshape how we remember him. What was the secret that the eternal optimist kept buried? The man who never aged, but carried a secret. At 95 years old, Dick Van Dyke still seemed like he had beaten time itself. His walk carried a bounce, his laugh still lit up a room. And when he moved, whether on stage or in interviews, there was a surprising grace that made people whisper, "How does he do it?" To his fans, Van Dyke wasn't just an actor. He was living proof that joy could keep a man young forever. But behind that lightness, behind the twinkle in his eyes, he carried something most people never knew. For more than 7 decades in the spotlight, he made audiences believe life could always be filled with song, dance, and laughter. And in many ways, it really was. But even the brightest smiles can hide shadows. Van Dyke revealed late in life that there was a truth, a deeply personal struggle, that he had hidden during all those years of fame. It wasn't just a small detail. It was the kind of secret that could change how fans remembered his entire journey. Imagine a man who could make millions laugh every night on television while quietly fighting a private battle. The secret isn't shame, Van Dyke would later reflect. It's part of what made me who I am. That statement reframed everything. Suddenly, the carefree dances and cheerful banter looked different, like they were part of a carefully painted picture. He wasn't only the man who never aged, he was the man who carried a secret for a lifetime, waiting until he was nearly a century old to tell it. What happens when an actor, loved by generations, finally opens the curtain on what he kept hidden? It becomes more than a confession. It becomes a legacy-altering moment. Fans who thought they knew every step of his story suddenly realize there's more, and that realization deepens their love rather than shattering it. Because if someone like Dick Van Dyke could struggle and still shine so brightly, maybe that's what makes him legendary. His revelation sets the tone for his entire life story. It forces us to look back at his career not as a straight path of triumph, but as a winding journey of success, struggle, and survival. And that is where his tale truly begins, not with the secret itself, but with the dazzling career that made him a household name. Because to understand what he carried, we first need to revisit how he built the image of the man who never stopped smiling. And so, the spotlight shifts from the secret to the stage where it all began. Because before the world saw the truth, they saw the laughter. Behind the curtain, a career told in smiles. Dick Van Dyke's career didn't arrive in Hollywood like a sudden explosion. It grew step by step, from radio shows and nightclubs where he first learned how to charm an audience. His big break came with Bye Bye Birdie, where his long legs and wide grin made him an instant star. Soon after, The Dick Van Dyke Show turned him into the face of American comedy. The kind of actor who seemed to make life feel lighter just by walking into a room. Fans adored him because he always played the everyman, the goofy dad, the cheerful neighbor, the man who laughed through mistakes. "I always saw myself as the guy next door," Van Dyke once said, "just trying to make people laugh." On the surface, it looked effortless. Every performance, every pratfall, every dance across the screen felt like it came from a man who had nothing but joy to give. But while audiences saw only the sparkle, Van Dyke was careful to keep another side of his life out of the public eye. The stage was where he poured his energy, his optimism, and his talent. Off stage, though, there were struggles that fans never glimpsed. That contrast, the constant balance between public joy and private friction, is what makes his eventual revelation so powerful. Think about the timing. For decades, while the world laughed with him, no one suspected there was more to the story. Even during the highest points of his career, when he was appearing in films like Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, he carried the weight of something he refused to show. The smiles were real, but they were also part of a shield, a way of protecting not only himself, but also his audience from seeing his pain. This doesn't make his performances any less magical. It makes them more human. Knowing what he carried, those songs and dances become feats of strength as much as entertainment. They were not only about making people happy, but also about proving to himself that joy could win out, at least for a little while. The story of Dick Van Dyke is one of contrast, between the brightness the world adored and the struggles he kept hidden. And when the secret finally came out, it didn't weaken his legacy, it deepened it. Because now, when we look back at his early career, at all those smiles, we see them not as a mask, but as evidence of courage. And that's where the tension builds, because the secret wasn't just about his work, it was about survival. And survival would become the unspoken theme of his life, revealed most clearly when he finally spoke of the battle that shaped his world. A secret shrouded in longevity. Living to 95 is rare. Living to 99 with the energy of a man half that age is almost unheard of. And yet, when people looked at Dick Van Dyke, they saw exactly that. A miracle of longevity. His bright step, his unmistakable voice, and his constant smile convinced millions that maybe he had discovered some secret formula to defy time. But what if the real secret wasn't about staying young, but about what he kept hidden while doing it? For years, fans asked him how he managed to remain so vibrant. Van Dyke would laugh, shrug, and offer little pieces of wisdom. Keep moving, keep smiling, don't stop. His memoir, 100 Rules for Living to 100, was teased as a book of optimism and energy, a cheerful guide to aging gracefully. But beneath those upbeat rules was a deeper, untold truth. Longevity, in his case, wasn't just about living well, it was about living despite. Think of the contrast. On one hand, Hollywood celebrated him as the man who seemed untouchable, never sick, never tired, always ready with a joke. On the other hand, Van Dyke carried the memory of battles fought far away from the spotlight. His energy, his routines, his discipline weren't simply about vanity or show. They were the scaffolding that held him together, the structure that kept his spirit from collapsing under the weight of things he chose not to reveal until late in life. And as the years passed, this question grew sharper. What exactly kept him going? Was it really just optimism, or was it survival dressed as joy? When Van Dyke finally opened up, the answer became clear. The real miracle wasn't his longevity. It was his resilience. He had lived long not just by accident of good health, but by refusing to let his struggles define the man he presented to the world. This revelation made his long life feel less like a miracle and more like a testament. His secret, when revealed, was not about some magic diet or endless youth. It was about enduring through difficulty, about outlasting his pain until it no longer had power over him. "I never wanted to burden people with my struggles," he admitted. "They came to me for laughter, not sadness." That honesty hit fans with both surprise and admiration, because in that moment, the man who seemed superhuman suddenly became human again, and yet no less inspiring. If anything, the revelation gave his longevity even more meaning. He wasn't just living long. He was living proof that even hidden pain doesn't have to steal your joy. And so, as Van Dyke reached his late 90s, the myth of the man who never aged gave way to something richer. The story of a man who carried his secret with dignity. But now, with the truth finally spoken, his life story turned toward its most vulnerable chapter. The moment he named the hidden struggle that shaped it all. The hidden struggle: addiction and recovery. Behind the laughter, behind the musicals, behind the television magic, Dick Van Dyke lived with a reality few ever guessed: alcoholism. In the early 1970s, at the height of his career, he quietly checked himself into rehab, a move that shocked even those close to him when he later revealed it. To the world, he was the king of lighthearted comedy. In private, he was fighting a battle that could have ended his career, or worse, his life. "I was drinking too much and I knew it," Van Dyke once admitted. "I didn't want it to destroy me, so I asked for help." It was a confession that took courage, especially in an era when addiction carried heavy stigma. But back then, he didn't share this truth publicly. Instead, he chose to keep it hidden, presenting only the cheerful entertainer fans loved. This choice shaped everything. While audiences saw the flawless performances, Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, The Dick Van Dyke Show, Van Dyke was privately struggling to stay in control. Every smile, every tap dance across the stage became both a performance and a form of escape. He fought his demons with the same energy he brought to his comedy, determined that the public would never see him falter. But here's the irony. By keeping the battle secret, he also made his achievements even more remarkable. What looked effortless was, in reality, the result of extraordinary strength. "Addiction doesn't care who you are," he later said. "It doesn't care if you're successful or loved. It tries to take everything, and you have to fight back." When Van Dyke finally spoke about his addiction years later, the revelation stunned fans. Yet instead of tarnishing his reputation, it humanized him. The man who had always seemed larger than life suddenly became relatable. Proof that even legends can stumble, and that recovery is possible. His decision to face his addiction head-on, rather than let it define him, became one of his greatest victories. And recovery wasn't just about sobriety. It was about learning to rebuild, to find new ways to keep his joy alive without the crutch of alcohol. That's why his later years became so meaningful. Every dance step at age 95, every laugh shared with fans at 99, became a symbol of survival. He wasn't just aging well, he was living proof that healing is possible. The hidden struggle of addiction, once revealed, reshaped how fans saw his entire career. No longer just the goofy dad or the cheerful song and dance man, Van Dyke became something more. A survivor, a fighter, a man who endured and still found ways to shine. And so his secret didn't weaken his legacy, it strengthened it. Because now every story of his long, extraordinary life carried a deeper message. That joy is not the absence of struggle. It's what you choose in spite of it. The discipline of the body and soul. When most people think of Dick Van Dyke in his 90s, they don't picture a frail man fading quietly into old age. They picture him dancing, laughing, and moving with the same spirit he carried in his youth. What many didn't realize, though, is that this wasn't luck or magic. It was discipline, a lifelong commitment to keeping both body and soul alive. Even in his late 90s, Van Dyke worked out 3 times a week. He swam, walked, lifted weights, and even did water aerobics. "You've got to keep moving," he once said. If you rest, you rust. To him, exercise wasn't optional. It was survival. His body became his partner, and he treated it with respect, pushing it to keep pace with his spirit. But it wasn't just about muscles or stamina. Van Dyke also shaped his life around diet and habits that kept him sharp. He cut out red meat, stayed away from salty foods and alcohol, and instead filled his meals with leafy greens, blueberries, turmeric, and fish. He wasn't chasing youth. He was fueling resilience. Every choice was part of a system, a structure that allowed him to keep doing what he loved, performing, laughing, and sharing joy. Yet, there was something deeper underneath these routines. His workouts and his diet weren't only about health. They were about control. After years of hiding the struggles of addiction, Van Dyke learned that his body could be both his anchor and his escape. Staying disciplined gave him a way to fight back, to protect himself from slipping into the shadows again. It wasn't vanity. It was survival disguised as vitality. And it wasn't only physical discipline. Van Dyke carried a remarkable discipline of the spirit. He guarded his outlook, kept his thoughts light, and refused to let bitterness grow roots in his heart. That inner strength, coupled with his physical routine, became the secret weapon that allowed him to do what few in Hollywood ever managed. Not just to live long, but to live fully. Imagine him at 97, still walking into a gym, still lifting weights, still moving with intent. Imagine him at 98, dancing on television, while fans gasped at his energy. Every movement was more than entertainment. It was proof of endurance. It was a way of saying, I'm still here, and I'm not done yet. This discipline became his hidden armor, the scaffolding that held his legendary optimism in place. But optimism itself was its own form of power, a kind of shield that Van Dyke wore every single day. And that, more than anything, may have been his greatest secret. The optimist's armor. If Dick Van Dyke had one defining trait beyond his talent, it was his relentless optimism. For decades, no matter what he faced behind the curtain, the world only saw light. He laughed, he sang, he danced, and he made everyone around him feel like life could be better. But here's the truth. That optimism wasn't effortless. It was armor. I look forward to going to work every morning, Van Dyke once said, even in his 90s. To most people, that sounded like a cheerful quip. But behind those words was a deliberate choice. He didn't just happen to be positive. He worked at it. He built it. He used it as a shield. For Van Dyke, optimism wasn't about ignoring pain. It was about refusing to let pain take the spotlight. Think of it this way. Every smile he gave on camera, every laugh he shared, was not just a natural reflex. It was an act of courage. Because while fans saw sunshine, Van Dyke was quietly pushing back the darker moments of his past. Optimism became his way of surviving, of keeping his secrets safe, while still offering joy to others. And that's what made him so unique. Many performers use humor or charm as a mask. But for Van Dyke, it wasn't a mask, it was a mission. He believed people needed joy, and he gave it to them, even when it cost him something privately. People don't come to me for sadness, he once explained. They come for laughter. So that's what I gave. When fans finally learned about his struggles, his optimism took on a whole new meaning. Suddenly, every grin seemed braver, every joke more powerful. Because now we knew it wasn't effortless. It was earned. It was a deliberate stance against the shadows of addiction, loneliness, and age. It was not just a trait, but a practice. And the remarkable thing? It worked. His optimism didn't just protect his audience, it protected him. By choosing to stay positive, by putting joy first, Van Dyke gave himself a reason to keep going. It kept him active, kept him moving, and kept his spirit alive, even when his body grew old. Optimism was more than an attitude, it was his lifeline. That lifeline carried him through decades of fame, through personal battles, and into the late years of his life, when most people had already faded from public view. And yet, Van Dyke remained, not just present, but shining. His optimism made him timeless. But behind every laugh, behind every performance, there was still another layer. The creative fire that refused to go out. Because Van Dyke wasn't just an actor, he was an innovator. A man whose hidden passions shaped his career in ways most people never realized. And that's where the story leads next, into the quiet brilliance of a man who was more than what we saw. Beyond acting, animator, innovator, secret shaper. For most people, Dick Van Dyke was simply the man who danced across rooftops in Mary Poppins or made television history with The Dick Van Dyke Show. But what if we told you that behind the curtain, he was quietly building another legacy? One hidden not on stage, but inside the glowing screens of early technology. Yes, the man known for song and dance was also an innovator, an early enthusiast of computer animation. Long before CGI became the lifeblood of Hollywood, Van Dyke was experimenting with it in his own projects. Few fans know that he had actual credits in computer graphics, contributing effects to Diagnosis, Murder, and The Dick Van Dyke Show Revisited. It's a part of his story that never made headlines, but it revealed a truth. Van Dyke's creative spark didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. "I've always been curious," he once admitted. "If something new came along, I wanted to try it." That curiosity became his hidden power. While many actors of his era clung to the old ways of entertainment, Van Dyke leaned forward into the future. He embraced technology, not as a gimmick, but as another form of storytelling. And here's where the parallel is striking. Just as he hid his personal struggles behind smiles, he hid his technological genius behind performances. To the public, he was still the happy-go-lucky comedian. But behind the scenes, he was tinkering, learning, creating, shaping projects with a skill most people never expected him to have. His life wasn't only about survival, it was about evolution. Even in his 90s, Van Dyke's name appeared on animation credits, proof that he never stopped reaching for something new. That quiet work gave depth to his legacy. He wasn't just a performer frozen in time. He was a creator who refused to stop growing. This side of him, the secret innovator, mirrored his emotional secrecy. While fans marveled at his youthful energy, he was building something entirely new in the shadows. The story of Van Dyke as an innovator also reframes his longevity. His ability to adapt, to dance not just on rooftops, but through decades of change, became his hidden gift. And when paired with the revelation of his struggles, it showed us a man who wasn't simply surviving, but constantly reinventing. So when fans finally hear about this hidden life, it changes the picture again. The man we thought we knew was not only a legend of the past, but a pioneer of the future. He proved that creativity doesn't fade with age. It just transforms. And as he approached his centennial year, this truth connected directly to his memoir. Because in those final pages, he wasn't just teaching rules for living, he was finally allowing his hidden truths about innovation, endurance, and struggle to come to light. A Century's Wisdom, the memoir's hidden truth. When Dick Van Dyke announced his memoir, 100 Rules for Living to 100, fans expected a cheerful, upbeat book. After all, who wouldn't want advice from the man who seemed to defy time? And yes, the book promised practical lessons: keep moving, laugh often, eat well. But when you look closer, you realize something else. The memoir wasn't just a guide. It was a confession in disguise. For decades, Van Dyke's image was one of endless joy. But in the memoir, between the jokes and the optimism, a different voice emerges, a voice that hints at pain, at endurance, at secrets finally being let go. Life is not about avoiding the storm, he writes. It's about learning how to dance in the rain. To fans, it sounds like another charming line. But knowing his history, those words feel heavier. They reveal the survival strategies of a man who had weathered storms privately for years. The brilliance of the memoir is how it reframes his entire career. Rules that once looked like simple advice now feel like survival codes. Keep moving? That wasn't about exercise. It was about outrunning despair. Eat well? That wasn't about vanity. It was about rebuilding his health after addiction. Stay positive? That wasn't a slogan. It was armor. Each rule reads differently once you know the truth. This is where the suspense deepens. Because for the first time, Van Dyke isn't just giving us the entertainer's version of himself. He's letting the cracks show. He's inviting readers to see not just the man who lived long, but the man who fought to live. It's subtle, but it's powerful. And there's another layer. By writing this book as he neared 100, Van Dyke was doing more than leaving advice. He was reclaiming his story. For decades, others had written about him as the eternal optimist, the man untouched by age or struggle. But with this memoir, he was finally the one telling the full story, on his terms. I don't want people to think it was all easy, he reflects in its pages, but I do want them to know it was worth it. That single line changes everything. The book stops being just a playful guide to aging. It becomes a legacy statement. It is the closing act of a man who wants to be remembered not only for his laughter, but for his resilience. In the end, 100 Rules for Living. To 100 isn't about rules at all. It's about honesty. It's about lifting the veil and showing that joy, discipline, and survival can coexist. It's about leaving behind not just entertainment, but wisdom. And so, as the memoir is released, fans realize they are witnessing something rare: the transformation of a legend into a fully seen man. A man who gave the world laughter, yes, but also gave it truth. And with that truth, the story moves toward its most poignant chapter: the cost of carrying such secrets for nearly a century, the cost of hiding the truth. Longevity is a gift, but for Dick Van Dyke, it was also a burden. Living to nearly 100, he outlived friends and colleagues, his once effortless charm slowly giving way to frailty. Yet even with a cane, he smiled, performed, entertained. Behind that determination, though, was a price. For decades, he hid his addiction and its scars. Discipline, exercise, and optimism helped him recover. But the silence left him isolated. "I didn't want people to see me weak," he admitted. Maintaining the sunny mask became its own exhaustion. When he finally revealed the truth, it wasn't met with rejection. It was met with love. What he thought would diminish his legend instead enriched it. The act of confession gave him something priceless: peace. Legacy. Redefined. A man at peace. As Van Dyke neared his centennial, survival gave way to acceptance. The secret was out, and his legacy grew deeper. Optimism became courage, discipline became survival, and his smile became a deliberate choice to spread joy despite pain. Maybe what I'm leaving behind is proof that joy can win, even in the hardest times, he reflected. That became his true gift, not just laughter, but truth. In the end, he wasn't only a performer. He was a survivor, creator, and man of light who carried shadows. And in revealing them, he finally found peace. As the curtain closes, Van Dyke's secret no longer hides in the shadows. It transforms his legacy, turning smiles into symbols of strength and survival. At nearly a century of life, he shows us that joy is not the absence of struggle, but the courage to shine through it.